Kamchatka did not forgive weakness. It ground it up, mixed it with volcanic ash, and scattered it with a cold, salty wind blowing from the Pacific Ocean. Senior Lieutenant of the KGB border troops of the USSR Alexei Volkov did not learn this rule from the regulations. He absorbed it with the air, with each dawn that lazily and reluctantly licked the razor-sharp ridges of extinct volcanoes. Here, at the easternmost outpost of the vast motherland, time flowed differently. It was viscous, thick, like cooling lava, and consisted of two states: long, agonizing waiting and short, furious flashes of action. September 1989 was particularly chilly. Low, heavy clouds clung to the tops of the hills, dropping a fine, icy drizzle to the ground. It covered the tarpaulin on the roof of the barracks, the rusting barbed wire on the perimeter, and the black, lifeless earth of the outpost, made of crushed volcanic pumice. Volkov stood at the window of his tiny office, which also served as a bedroom, and looked out at this dismal palette of gray and black. In his hands, a mug of scalding hot, bitter chifer steamed. The only thing that could still get the blood flowing in this kingdom of cold and apathy. His unit, 6 men including himself, was not just a garrison. They were a handful of people on the edge of the world, a small island of Soviet power in the middle of primeval chaos. 6 men against hundreds of kilometers of wild, untrodden land, where a bear felt more like a master than the general secretary of the CPSU Central Committee. Each of his fighters was not chosen by chance. Strong, silent Siberian men for whom a frost of -30 was an annoying nuisance, not a natural disaster. They served, they pulled the strap, and they were silent. There was nothing much to talk about here. The landscape had not changed for centuries. The orders were the same. Life had frozen like resin on the trunk of a larch. Suddenly the silence was broken by a sharp, hysterical crackle of the R105M radio station. It burst into the office like an uninvited guest, causing Volkov to shudder. "First, I'm Sokol 2. Over." Private Sinitsyn's voice from the distant observation post was tense. "On the line, Sokol 2. "Report," Volkov replied, approaching the device. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, we have movement. Sector Gamma 1. I repeat, 1. Coming from the direction of Dvugurboy Hill, cross the control and tracking strip. Moving deeper into our territory." Volkov frowned. Alone. That was odd. Subversive groups, smugglers, even lost geologists, they always went in pairs or threes. A loner in these parts was either a madman or a suicide bomber. Character of movement: fast, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. Purposeful: doesn't look like he's lost. He knows exactly where he's going. Did you carry out the warnings? Yes, sir. 2 bursts in the air. 0 reaction. Didn't even duck. Just kept going. This was already beyond the pale. Only someone who didn't care at all whether they were shot at or not could not react to warning fire. Direction of movement? There was silence in the speaker for a second. Sinitsyn seemed to hesitate. Towards the Valley of Geysers, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. Straight towards it. Volkov felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the Kamchatka weather. The Valley of Geysers. The local Idelmans, a few in number, called this place the land of breathing spirits and avoided it like the plague. They believed that the steam rising from the ground steals a person's soul, showing him what he should not see. Nonsense, of course. Superstition. But even seasoned border guards did not like this place. Remote, stinking, with an ever-changing landscape due to bubbling mud cauldrons and sudden emissions of steam. Watch. I'm raising the group. Over and out. 5 minutes later, 5 figures in camouflage suits the color of wet earth walked out of the outpost gates. In front was Senior Lieutenant Volkov. Next to him was Sergeant Morozov, his deputy, a gloomy giant with a heavy, bull-like gaze. Behind him were privates Kravtsov, Belov, and Zaitsev, a staff medic. 5 men armed with Kalashnikovs moved toward the unknown. They caught up with the intruder as they approached the valley. Volkov saw him through binoculars. A man in a shabby civilian jacket and worn-out trousers, completely unsuitable for this terrain. He really was walking at some inhuman, monotonous speed, without looking back, without choosing a road. His feet found support on the slippery rocks and scree by themselves. He was walking towards a goal that only he could see. "Stop! I'll shoot!" Volkov shouted into a megaphone. The figure didn't even slow down. "Fire at the legs." "Burst," the major ordered. A long burst fired by Morozov churned up the earth and rocks a few meters behind the intruder. But he kept going. He was already entering the zone where the first rare streams of steam were beginning to appear, escaping from the ground. "Follow me. Take him alive," Volkov shouted, and the squad broke into a run. The chase was grueling. They were carrying full gear, weapons, ammunition. And he was light. But that was not all. The air was becoming thick, humid, filled with the smell of sulfur. It was becoming difficult to breathe. Hot, multicolored clay squelched underfoot. They had entered the Valley of Geysers. The intruder seemed to dissolve in the thick fog that swirled above the ground. His figure became ghostly, indistinct. Volkov felt his heart pounding, but it was not just the fatigue of running. It was an irrational, primal anxiety. Something was wrong with this place, with this air, with this man. He was leading them like the Pied Piper in a children's fairy tale. He was leading them into the very heart of the land of breathing spirits. And they, soldiers of a great power, armed to the teeth, obediently followed him into this trap, not yet knowing that the pursuit of the border violator had long since ended, and the pursuit of their own elusive minds had begun. The fog did not swallow them up at once. At first it looked like sparse, wispy clouds, lazily creeping along the ground. The squad rushed into them without slowing down, and for a moment the world lost its color, becoming monochrome, and then regained its meager, sickly colors. But the deeper they went after the ghostly figure of the intruder, the more densely this white, damp haze closed around them. Soon they were no longer running on the ground, but inside thick, warm milk. Visibility dropped to 10, then to 5 meters. The figure of the pursued, looming ahead until then, finally dissolved, as if it had never been there. "Stop!" Volkov's command, given no longer as a shout, but in a tense, hoarse voice, sank into the fog, leaving no echo. The fighters huddled together, breathing heavily. Their breath came out of their mouths in white clouds that immediately mixed with the surrounding steam, making it even thicker. They stood on a small patch of gray clay that sprang under their feet, surrounded on all sides by an impenetrable white wall. The sounds had changed. The hollow, guttural churning of the mud cauldrons and the furious hissing of the geysers, which had previously been just a background, had now become the main characters. They came from everywhere and nowhere, creating an ominous, disorienting polyphony. The sound of footsteps became dull, cottony. It seemed as if the ground beneath their feet was soft and pliable, like a sick body. "I don't see anything." Comrade Senior Lieutenant, Sergeant Morozov, turned his head. His massive body seemed tense, like a compressed spring, like he drowned in milk. "Where did he go?" Volkov didn't answer. He took a radio station out of his pouch. "Sokol 2, this is number 1. "Over," he said into the PTT. In response, there was only a steady, soporific hiss. White noise. He switched frequencies, then again. The result was the same, as if someone had cut them off from the rest of the world with invisible scissors. "No connection," he stated, putting the device away. The anxiety that had been only a faint premonition before began to take shape. Kravtsov, the compass. Private Kravtsov, the youngest in the squad, looked up from his contemplation of the fog with obvious relief and looked at his wrist. His face lengthened. "It's broken or something," he muttered. "The needle, it's spinning, comrade senior lieutenant. It's just spinning in a circle." Volkov pulled out his tablet compass, an old, reliable artillery one. The blue needle that marked north spun lazily and chaotically, as if it couldn't decide which way to look. The Earth's magnetic field didn't work here, or worked differently. They weren't just cut off from communications. They were lost in space. The air became even denser. Now it clearly smelled not only of sulfur, but also of some other, barely perceptible taste. Metallic, as if he had licked the contacts of a battery. It became difficult to breathe. Each breath required effort. "What are we going to do, Commander?" asked the medic Zaitsev, his voice nervous. "Maybe we should go back? Retrace our steps." Volkov looked at the ground. Their tracks, clearly imprinted on the damp clay just 5 minutes ago, were already closing in, melting away, as if the earth was slowly digesting them, erasing any reminder of their presence. There was nowhere to go back. There was only one way forward. Blindly. Move forward. Slowly. Hold on to each other, 2 meters apart. Don't spread out. Morozov, you're in front. I'm behind you. Belov brings up the rear. Look for a way out of the fog. The intruder is somewhere here. Keep your eyes peeled, Volkov ordered, trying to make his voice sound as confident as possible. They moved like a group of blind men, their machine guns held out in front of them. The world narrowed to the back of the comrade in front of them, and 2 meters of earth vibrating under their feet. The landscape they were passing through looked like pictures from hell. To their left, a huge bubble of mud burst with a loud squelch, dousing them with hot spray. To their right, a column of steam as tall as a 3-story building roared out from under the ground, making them instinctively duck. The earth was alive. It breathed, spat, moaned. Time lost its linearity. How long had they been walking? 10 minutes? An hour? 2? Without sun, without landmarks, in a monotonous, soporific fog, consciousness began to float. Volkov felt a slight dizziness creeping up. He shook his head, trying to concentrate. He was a commander. He had no right to weakness. But this place, it was pressing. It was seeping through the thick fabric of his pea coat, through his skin, right into his bones, into his brain. Sometimes he thought he could hear fragments of words in the hissing steam, inaudible whispers that were quickly drowned out by the general roar. He chalked it up to exhaustion, to auditory hallucinations from the monotonous noise. But the feeling that they were not alone here was growing stronger. And it wasn't about the intruder. It was about something else, about this place itself. It seemed as if the valley itself was watching them, indifferently and expectantly. They came to a small clearing where the fog was thinner. They looked out onto a small, perfectly round lake with water of an incredible turquoise color. The water was steaming, but it was not boiling. It was calm, like a mirror, and in this ominous silence, Volkov felt real, irrational fear for the first time. Not for the mission, not for his people, for himself. He suddenly desperately wanted to look into this mirror-like surface, to see his reflection, as if it were vitally important. "Let's move on. Don't stop," he ordered, not understanding why his voice sounded so harsh. They walked around the lake and plunged into the thick fog again. The metallic taste in their mouths grew stronger. The dizziness became almost constant. Volkov looked at Morozov's back, and for a split second it seemed to him that the sergeant's uniform had changed, turning into a prison robe. He blinked, and the vision disappeared. Just a play of light and shadow in the fog. Just fatigue. It must be just fatigue. But somewhere deep inside, he already knew They were not chasing a man. They were following the trail of madness. And the fog that enveloped them was not just a natural phenomenon. It was a border, a boundary beyond which the laws of the familiar world ceased to apply. And they had just crossed it, irreversibly. The fog had no beginning and no end. It was everywhere. It hid under the collars of pea coats, settled as icy moisture on eyelashes penetrated into the lungs. Volkov felt its taste on his tongue, that same distinct chemical taste of metal, which was becoming stronger and stronger. Dizziness became a constant companion. It was not sharp, it was viscous and lulling, like a slight intoxication. Consciousness tried to protect itself from this monotonous reality, devoid of landmarks, clung to trifles, to the rhythm of its own breathing, to the creak of the straps on the shoulders, to the weight of the machine gun in frozen hands. They walked in complete silence. Any sound seemed out of place, alien in this silent realm. Even a mental order, which in another situation Volkov would have given out of habit, seemed blasphemous here. Thoughts became heavy, unwieldy. The first to break was Private Kravtsov, the youngest, a 19-year-old boy from near Voronezh, for whom this Kamchatka outpost was the first and, as he hoped, the last touch of the edge of the world. He tripped over a root invisible in the fog and, in order not to fall, instinctively put his hand forward, leaning on the damp, mossy ground. He stood up, shaking his palm, and froze. Comrade Senior Lieutenant. His voice was quiet, muffled, full of bewilderment. Volkov turned around. "What is it, Kravtsov?" "Hand, look." The private held out his palm. Under his nails, in the folds of his skin, was not dirt, not the black, rich earth of this valley. There were thick blue-black stains, like ink, as if he had just been fixing a fountain pen and it had leaked. He rubbed the stains. They would not rub off. They were part of his skin. For a moment, he even thought he could smell the familiar smell of printer's ink from childhood. He saw how these same stains covered his tunic, how he was sitting not in a fog, but at an old desk, bent over a sheet of paper and writing lines on it. Kravtsov. Volkov's sharp cry tore him out of his vision. The boy blinked, shook his head. The ink stains were gone. His palm was just dirt. He looked from his hand to the commander, and pure, unclouded horror splashed in his eyes. It seemed, he muttered, "Sorry, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. I'm probably tired." Volkov said nothing. He saw his face. He saw that it was not fatigue. It was something else. He ordered them to move on, but now each of the fighters, without even admitting it to himself, began to listen not only to the sounds outside, but also to the silence inside his head. And the anomaly, as if sensing their attention, their fear stopped hiding. It began to speak, not with words, with feelings. Volkov walked, looking at Morozov's back, and suddenly felt a familiar but long-forgotten weight on his shoulders. A phantom weight. He did not see them, but he felt them. Heavy, gilded general's shoulder straps. He felt the weight of a dress jacket, the creak of a new sword belt, the confident weight of the handle of an award pistol at his hip. He saw the hall of the board of the Ministry of Defense, dozens of attentive eyes directed at him, and heard his own confident, authoritative voice reading out a report. It lasted no more than a second. But in that second, he was not a senior lieutenant lost in the fog, but an all-powerful general in the center of his universe. The vision broke off, leaving behind a bitter feeling of loss and bewilderment. The orderly Zaitsev, walking behind him, stumbled. His hands, thin, with the long fingers of a musician or a surgeon, suddenly took on a monstrous leaden weight. He looked at them. They seemed alien to him, huge, calloused, with broken nails dug into the dirt. He felt the familiar vibration of the jackhammer handle, smelled machine oil and sweat. He was not an orderly. He was a factory worker, a miner, a builder. He was someone else. Someone who had spent his entire life doing hard, grueling physical labor. The sensation was so real that he almost dropped his machine gun. It could no longer be chalked up to fatigue. It was an epidemic, a silent, creeping virus that attacked not the body, but the very core of their personality, their memories, their sense of self. It was at this moment that Sergeant Morozov, who was walking ahead, stopped abruptly. "Quiet," he hissed. "There's something up ahead." They froze, listening. Through the hissing of the geysers came a new sound, a quiet, intermittent cry, or laughter. It was impossible to make out. An intruder, Volkov suggested. They moved forward, no longer as pursuers, but as hunters stalking a wounded animal. A few meters further, they came to the edge of a small basin. The fog was thinner here. At the bottom of the basin, leaning against a rock, sat a man. The same one. He was not crying or laughing. He was simply sitting, rocking back and forth, and looking at his hands. He did not notice them. He did not notice anything around him. There was an old canvas backpack lying on the ground next to him. They surrounded him. The man did not react. His eyes were open, but there was no thought, no fear in them. Only absolute, all-consuming emptiness. Volkov nodded to Morozov. The sergeant carefully lifted the backpack. It was heavy. Volkov unzipped it. Inside, wrapped in an oily rag, lay strange, unfamiliar devices. Something like a modified Geiger counter, but with several scales and copper coils. A field chronometer of strange design, and a thick, general notebook in an oilcloth cover. A diary. Volkov opened it. The pages were covered in hurried, nervous handwriting, interspersed with formulas and graphs. August 17th. It's not gas. It's not radiation. It's a field. A stable chrono-anomalous field, apparently generated by a unique combination of minerals and geothermal activity. It doesn't distort space. It distorts probability. Volkov turned the page. August 24th. I understood the principle. The field resonates with the neural activity of the human brain. It reads memory, but not the past. It reads bifurcation points, moments of choice. Every time we made a decision, from the most insignificant to the most fateful, we cut off countless alternative timelines. The field makes these dead lines visible. It shows not what was, but what could have been. The handwriting on the next page became almost illegible, the letters dancing. September 1st, called it the paradox of choice. The visions are getting stronger. Today I was a lead engineer at Baikonur for half an hour. I felt proud of the rocket launch. And then I was a repeat offender, dying from a cellmate's knife in Magadan. My mind can't cope with this flow. My personality, it's starting to fall apart. I'm not me. I am a sum of all my fail versions. And they're all screaming at once. The last entry was written in large, clumsy letters, the pencil tearing the paper. September 3rd. He brought me here, God, or the devil, to show me everything. I've seen everything. I've been a hero and a coward, a saint and a murderer. It's unbearable. The only way to stop it is to stop choosing, to stop being. I'll stay here. I'll just sit and stare at my hands. The only thing that's real. The instrument that made me me. Volkov slammed the diary shut. His hand was shaking. Now he knew. They knew. This wasn't fog. This wasn't an anomaly. This was hell. A personal, existential hell created specifically for each of them. And they were at the very center of it. And the man sitting in front of them wasn't an intruder. He was a warning. And it was too late. The silence that followed Volkov's slamming the journal shut was deafening. It was thicker and more terrifying than the fog that had blanketed the valley. It was the silence of awareness. 5 living, breathing men and 1 man sitting against a rock, alive only physically, looked at each other, and their eyes reflected the same thing, understanding of the sentence. They had read the instructions for their own execution. The enemy was not a creature of flesh and blood that could be shot. It could not be outflanked or outwitted. The enemy was in the very air they breathed, the very ground they walked on. But worst of all, the enemy's greatest ally was inside each of their heads. Their own lives, their memories, their choices. Volkov looked at the nameless scientist. Now he understood him. This was not a madman. This was a man who had looked beyond the edge and could not find the strength to return. He had chosen non-existence as the only salvation from infinity. We have to leave. Morozov's voice sounded muffled and uncertain. Back. Immediately. But no one moved. They all understood the futility of this proposal. They had already breathed this air. They were already infected. The anomaly was already probing them, scanning them, picking the keys to the locks of their souls. The brief, second-long visions they had experienced before were only calibration. A check of the connection. The real storm was yet to come. And it began. The fog, which had been hanging there as a dense mass, began to move. It began to thicken, to swirl, to twist into slow, silent eddies. The metallic taste in their mouths became unbearable, acrid, as if they were chewing on tinfoil. And then the world around them began to disintegrate. For Volkov, it all started with his hands. He looked down at his palms in tactical gloves, clutching his machine gun, and he saw how the rough fabric of the gloves became transparent for a moment, and underneath it his own skin became covered in age-related pigment spots. He felt how his joints ached, how his fingers obeyed poorly. He was not a 30-year-old senior lieutenant. He was a deep, feeble old man, living out his days alone. He felt the bitterness of an unlived life, longing for departed friends, fear of imminent, inevitable death. He blinked, and the vision disappeared. But another one immediately took its place. His hands were not gloved. They were covered in blood. Warm, sticky, alien blood. He felt the weight of the knife in his right hand. He saw a frightened face distorted by pain, and he knew that he had just committed murder. The wave of shame and animal fear of retribution was immediately washed away by a third wave. Now his hands were clean and smooth. They held not a machine gun, but the tiny, wrinkled body of a baby wrapped in a blanket. His son. He felt an all-consuming, irrational love and tenderness, such as he had never felt in his life. He was a father. He was happy. General, old man, murderer, father. Hero, traitor, scientist, drunk. All those lives, all those what-ifs that had been abstract thoughts before, now crashed down on him as a real, physical experience. Every fork in his fate, every choice made and not made, branched off into 1,000 other realities, and his consciousness was forced to live them all. Simultaneously, his brain couldn't cope. He tried to cling to reality, to his identity. I'm Alexei Volkov, senior lieutenant. I am 32 years old. I am in Kamchatka. But this thought was drowned in the cacophony of other personalities, other memories, other lives that demanded their own, screaming that they were also real. He felt pride in the Order of the Red Star he had received, and at the same time, the humiliation of a slap in the face from his drunken father in his distant childhood. He felt the taste of victory in hand-to-hand combat and the taste of cheap port wine in a dirty alley. Joy and pain, triumph and shame, love and hate. All these emotions mixed into one unbearable, all-consuming cocktail that burned him from the inside. He saw that the same thing was happening to his fighters. Sergeant Morozov, a gloomy giant, fell to his knees. His huge, strong body shook with silent sobs. In his one, real life, he was alone, gloomy, unsociable. He had never been able to build a family. And now he saw her. He saw the wife he had never met. He heard the laughter of children he had never had. He felt the warmth of the home he had been deprived of. And this impossible, phantom love was a torture worse than any physical pain. He cried from happiness, and at the same time from the realization that he had never had all this and never would. Private Kravtsov, a young man who dreamed of becoming a writer, stood there with his mouth open. His eyes darted madly. He was living the triumph of his first published book, winning literary prizes, performing for rapturous readers. And at the same time, he saw himself dying of wounds in an Afghan gorge, drinking himself to death in obscurity without ever having written a line, working a boring, hateful job in an office. He was a genius and a loser, a creator and a nonentity. The chase was forgotten. The mission was forgotten. The world had shrunk to this small patch of land where 5 people were losing the greatest battle of their lives, the battle for their own selves. They had stopped resisting. It was impossible. Like resisting the ocean. They were simply drowning in it. And then, instinctively, in a last attempt to find a foothold, to find something real in this storm of illusions, they all did the same thing. They looked at their hands. Volkov looked at his palms, not at the phantom hands of a general or a murderer, at his own, the real ones. He saw the calluses from the machine gun. He saw the old, whitened scar on the knuckle of his index finger. He saw the dirt under his nails. These hands were proof, the only irrefutable document proving his identity. These hands had not signed the orders to attack. These hands had not held the surgeon's scalpel. These hands had not embraced his wife and children. These hands had served here in Kamchatka. They were evidence of his only real lived path. They all looked at their hands. Sergeant Morozov saw calluses from oars and scars from army fights. Orderly Zaitsev saw thin fingers that could only apply bandages and give injections. They looked at them as if enchanted, as if at the only map in a world where all the roads had been erased. They sat on the ground, rocking back and forth like the scientist. Their machine guns lay nearby, useless pieces of iron. Their eyes were open, but they no longer saw the fog and the geysers. They saw thousands of unlived lives. And through this deafening internal scream, they tried to hear the quiet whisper of their own, the only reality, contained in the pattern of lines on their palms. They were no longer soldiers. They were no longer people. They were spectators in an endless movie theater where films about their own failed destinies were being shown on all the screens at once. And this show was never supposed to end. Never. A week passed. A week of thick, viscous silence. For Kamchatka, with its changeable weather and unstable communications, this was nothing out of the ordinary. But when an entire border patrol, led by an experienced officer, stops communicating, the silence begins to weigh. It turns from a simple lack of signal into a tangible, ominous threat. Border Guard Captain Dmitry Nestorov, commander of the search and rescue team, reread the order for the 3rd time. The words were dry and official, but behind them was the poorly concealed anxiety of the command. Conduct search operations, establish location, report the situation. Between the lines it read, find them, damn it, alive or dead. Senior Lieutenant Volkov's group had disappeared, just vanished. Their last report was of pursuing a lone intruder toward the Valley of Geysers. After that, silence. Nestorov, a pragmatic man far from mysticism, had assumed the worst: a landslide, hydrogen sulfide poisoning, a bear attack. Kamchatka was generous with ways to die, but 6 trained, armed to the teeth border guards who had disappeared without a trace? That was too much even for her. Nesterov's search party consisted of 10 men, the most experienced trackers and survivalists that could be found on this side of the world. They were moving along the last known route of Volkov's detachment. The weather seemed to be against them. Low clouds poured an icy drizzle on them, and the wind, breaking through the ravines, howled like a wounded animal. They found the first traces on the third day of searching, a chain of army boot prints leading from the foot of the hill towards the valley. Nearby were several machine gun shells. Warning, one of the fighters stated. Everything is according to the regulations. That means everything was still in order at that moment. The deeper they went into the valley, the more the atmosphere changed. The air became heavy, damp, saturated with the pungent smell of sulfur. Nesterov felt his throat begin to itch. The hot clay squelched under their feet, and jets of steam burst out from under the ground every now and then, forcing the group to shy away. A bad place, muttered one of the trackers. An old, weather-beaten ensign who had spent 20 years in Kamchatka. The locals don't come here. They say the fog here takes away your memory. Nesterov just chuckled. He didn't believe in fairy tales, but he couldn't help but admit that there was something deeply wrong about this place. Oppressive. The silence was unnatural. The sounds were distorted. And then the fog covered them. It descended suddenly in a thick, white sheet, cutting them off from the world. Visibility dropped to a few meters. Radios hissed and fell silent. Compasses, like those of Volkov's group, went crazy. Nesterov felt a chill run down his spine. He understood all too well what his men were feeling now. A feeling of complete, absolute isolation. They were walking almost blindly, orienting themselves only by barely discernible tracks on the ground, which were becoming more and more blurred with each passing minute. "Comrade Captain, my head is spinning," one of the soldiers complained, "and my mouth tastes like I licked iron." Nesterov himself felt it. Light nausea, disorientation. He attributed it to fumes, to oxygen starvation. But the feeling of anxiety grew. He drove away thoughts about the ensign's superstitions, but they persistently crept into his head. A fog that takes away memory. Ahead, the cry of the lookout walking ahead made everyone freeze. "I see them." Nesterov's heart skipped a beat. Joy? Relief? No. What he felt was icy, primal fear. The sentry's voice trembled. They rushed forward and ran out into a small clearing where the fog was a little thinner. And they saw them. The picture that met their eyes defied any logical explanation. It was so silent, static, and monstrously wrong that the brain refused to accept it. In the center of the clearing, on the wet, gray clay, sat 6 men. Volkov's squad. They sat in different poses, but all were facing the center. Their machine guns lay nearby, carelessly thrown into the mud. Meats, kit bags, everything was in place. No signs of a struggle. No signs of an attack by a beast. Not a drop of blood. But that wasn't the worst thing. They were alive. Their chests rose and fell slowly in time with their breathing. Their eyes were wide open, but they were empty, absolutely empty, like the eyes of glass dolls. They didn't look at the rescuers who arrived. They didn't react to their cries. They didn't notice anything. All 6 of them, from the senior lieutenant to the last private, looked at their hands. Nesterov slowly, as if in a dream, approached Volkov. He squatted down in front of him. Lisha, can you hear me?" Zero reaction. Volkov's gaze was fixed on his own palms, lying on his knees. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, clenched and unclenched his fingers, as if he were trying to remember how to do it, or as if he saw on the lines of his skin something infinitely more important than the figure of his comrade. Pulse is normal. Breathing is regular. No external injuries. The search party staff paramedic reported after checking one of the soldiers. His voice trembled with a mixture of bewilderment and horror. They're just sitting there. They're conscious, their pupils are reacting to light, but they're not here. They're in a stupor, in a complete, deep stupor. Nesterov stood up and looked around at his men. The faces of the seasoned men, who had been through fire and water, showed frank, superstitious fear. They looked at the quiet detachment not as victims, but as the damned, as those who had touched something that should not be touched and paid for it with their minds. The ensign tracker crossed himself slowly, looking at this terrible, silent scene. The spirits of the earth were disturbed, he whispered. She took their souls. Only their bodies were left. Nesterov wanted to bark at him, to order him to stop talking nonsense. But the words stuck in his throat. He looked at the 6 motionless figures, at their empty eyes, at their fascinated gazes, riveted to their own hands, and he understood that no regulations or instructions could have prepared him for this. He had found a missing squad, but there was no one to save. In front of him sat 6 living corpses, 6 empty shells whose minds had been erased, stolen, annihilated by whatever lived in this damned fog. And this was more terrible than any death. The Mi-8 helicopter, its blades chopping heavily through the thick, humid air, landed on a hidden platform in the forest. From its belly came 6 stretchers, 6 motionless bodies covered with army blankets. They were not being taken to a regular military hospital. They were being taken to Object 14, a secret medical battalion under the control of the KGB, a place that did not exist on civilian maps. A place where those who had seen or experienced things that could not be told were sent. The sterile corridors, painted the official pale green, smelled of bleach and fear. Here, far from the Kamchatka fogs, the horror had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. From the primitive and natural, it had become clinical, scientific, even more terrifying in its orderliness. The 6 border guards were placed in a separate, isolated block. 6 beds in one large ward. 6 pairs of empty, unblinking eyes staring at the ceiling. The project's lead physician, colonel of the medical service Ekaterina Andreevna Samov, a woman with a stern gaze and nerves of steel, reread the initial report for the 10th time. She had seen a lot. The consequences of combat psychological trauma, the results of interrogations using special means, people broken in secret prisons. But she had never encountered anything like this. The patients are in stable general condition. She dictated into a reel-to-reel tape recorder for the record, her voice flat and dispassionate. No physical damage has been detected. Blood and tissue tests reveal no known toxins, viruses, or pathogens. However, the encephalogram shows an abnormal pattern. The brains of all 6 patients are in a state of permanent hyperactive activity, primarily in the theta and gamma ranges. This is similar to REM sleep, but without the accompanying muscle atonia. The subjects are awake, but their consciousness is absent. It is completely absorbed in some internal process of tremendous intensity. The room was almost completely silent, broken only by the measured beep of the heart monitors. 6 soldiers lay on their beds. They did not move, did not speak, did not react to external stimuli. A nurse tried to feed one of them with a spoon. He did not swallow. The food simply fell out of his mouth. The doctor shone a flashlight into his eyes. The pupils narrowed, but the gaze remained empty. Only one, barely noticeable detail gave away that they were not in a coma. From time to time, their fingers slowly, almost imperceptibly clenched and unclenched, as if they were still looking at their hands, but now in their imagination. In parallel with the doctors, the major of the KGB Special Department, investigator for especially important cases Andrei Sidorov, was working. He was a man of a different nature. He was not interested in the waves on the encephalogram. but in facts, threats, and ways to neutralize them. In his office, which smelled of tobacco and strong coffee, on the table lay a folder marked Top Secret, case number 41 BIS. It contained a report by Captain Nestorov, the commander of the search group, photographs of this silent detachment found in the valley, and most importantly, the diary of an unknown scientist. Sidorov spent hours studying these scribbles, these crazy formulas and philosophical discussions about the paradox of choice. He did not understand even half of what was written, but the intuition of an experienced investigator told him that the key to the solution was right here. Chrono-anomalous field, probability distortion. He muttered, pacing the office. What kind of nonsense is this? Some schizophrenic physicist went crazy in the fog, and now we have to deal with it? Or is this not nonsense? He called Samov to him. Ekaterina Andreevna, is there any progress? He asked without preamble. Samov rubbed her temples tiredly. Progress? Andrei Pavlovich, we can't even make a diagnosis. This isn't amnesia, catatonia, or schizophrenia. This is something not described in any textbook. We've tried standard therapy. Sedatives don't work. Tranquilizers don't either. Yesterday, we gave Private Kravtsov a small dose of a psychostimulant to try to push his consciousness to the surface. So what? Sidorov asked impatiently. And we got a result that sent the nurse on duty into hysterics. Samova answered gloomily. Kravtsov came out of his stupor for a few seconds. He sat up on the bed, his eyes focused. He looked at his hands and screamed. But it wasn't just one scream. There were several voices, all coming from his throat at once. One screamed in horror, another in delight, a third in pain. And then he started talking. He spoke in quotes from books he'd never read, in languages he didn't know, describing events he'd never taken part in. And then he fell silent again, and now his condition is even worse than the others. We're afraid that any intervention will only accelerate the process of personality disintegration. Sidorov cursed. The picture was becoming increasingly grim. He had a potential threat of national significance on his hands, an anomalous zone capable of driving people crazy, and 6 carriers of this infection who could not be interrogated. Are they dangerous? He asked bluntly. As long as they're motionless, no. But we don't know what's going on in their heads. We don't know if this condition can be contagious. We keep them in complete isolation. The investigator returned to his office. Time was running out. The command demanded a report, explanations, proposals. And all he had were the empty eyes of soldiers, a folder with a madman's diary, and a feeling of complete, utter helplessness. He reread the last, most insane lines of the diary over and over again. I saw everything. It's unbearable. The only way to stop it is to stop choosing. And then it hit him. A simple, horrifyingly logical thought. If they couldn't get the soldiers out of this hell, maybe they should try going there with them. If they couldn't get answers, maybe they should at least write down their questions. He dialed Samov's number again. Ekaterina Andreevna, we need one. The strongest of them. We need to talk. It doesn't matter how. Use everything you have. Stimulants, hypnosis, truth serum. I don't care what the consequences are for him. I need the recording. I need to hear what they see there. That's an order. There was a long silence on the line. Samov knew that this would most likely kill the patient, but she also knew that she had no choice. Okay, she finally answered. We'll train Sergeant Morozov. He's the strongest. If anyone can handle it, it'll be him. The experiment was scheduled for the following morning. A last, desperate attempt to peer into the abyss, not knowing that the abyss had been looking at them for a long time. The ward in the special purpose block was like a sterile vacuum. There was no day or night here. Only the eternal, even lifeless light of fluorescent lamps, reflected off the pale green walls and white-tiled floor. The air was thick with the smell of medicine and poorly concealed fear. In the center of this vacuum, on a cot, hooked up to sensors, lay Sergeant Morozov. His powerful, trained body seemed alien in this environment, like a granite boulder in an operating room. Investigator Sidorov stood against the wall, arms crossed over his chest. Next to him, Colonel Samov was making final preparations, her face focused and tense. On the table by the bed stood a Yowza reel-to-reel tape recorder, its empty reels waiting, ready to absorb the madness. The experiment that Sidorov had insisted on was a last, desperate measure. It was an attempt not to cure, but to open, to crack the skull and extract the truth, even if the carrier itself was destroyed. "Let's begin," Samov said quietly. The nurse injected the first drug into Morozov's vein, a powerful psychostimulant mixed with a nootropic. For several minutes, nothing happened. The sergeant lay motionless, his chest heaving steadily. The beep of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room. Sidorov was beginning to think that this hadn't worked either. But then the body on the bed trembled, at first barely noticeably, as if from a chill, then more strongly. Morozov's fingers, which had been lying limply on the blanket, clenched into fists with such force that his knuckles turned white. His eyelids fluttered. The blood pressure and pulse rate jumped sharply, the nurse reported. Morozov's body arched. A strangled, hoarse sound came from his throat. Not a scream, not a groan, but something in between, the sound of breaking ice. And then he suddenly went limp and opened his eyes. These were not the empty, glassy eyes they had seen for the past week. There was depth in them. There was horror in them. They slowly scanned the room, lingered on Samov's face, on Sidorov's figure, and stopped on his own hands, lying on the blanket. "Turn on the recording," Sidorov whispered. Morozov slowly, with visible effort, turned his head. His dry lips moved. "Where? Where am I?" The voice was alien, creaky, like unlubricated door hinges. "You're safe, Sergeant," Samov said softly but clearly. "We're trying to help you. Tell us what you remember, what you saw there." Morozov was silent. His gaze returned to his hands. He looked at them for a long time, as if trying to read something written on his skin. "I saw," he began, his voice shaking and breaking. "I saw everything." The tape reels began their silent rotation. At first it was like static, short flashes. I'm walking through the fog, and suddenly I feel my hands getting rough, calluses forming on them from the axe. I'm a lumberjack. I smell pine, hear the crash of a falling tree. A second, and everything disappears. I'm Sergeant Morozov again, and 5 minutes later, I'm already standing on the stage. Spotlights. Applause. I'm a famous opera singer. I feel my vocal cords vibrating, my chest filling with air before I hit a high note. I've never been able to sing, Comrade Major. Never. He spoke slowly, with long pauses, as if he were pulling red-hot fragments out of himself. And then they came in a stream, without a break. They mixed together. I was all three, at the same time. Here I am, a war hero, leading men into attack, a fire of righteous anger burning in my chest. And at the same moment, I'm a coward, sitting in a stinking basement, shaking from every rustle. I have betrayed everyone I could. And I feel both. Pride and a sticky, sickening shame. They did not replace each other. They were together, in one head. Sidorov listened without moving. He saw Morozov's face change. It was distorted by a grimace of pain, then lit up by a weak, blissful smile, then became a mask of cold despair. "I had a family," the sergeant whispered, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "A wife, Natasha. She had rye-colored hair and funny freckles on her nose. And 2 children, a boy and a girl. I remember teaching my son to ride a bike. I remember my daughter crying when she scraped her knee. I remember the smell of them. I love them like I've never loved anyone in this life. And then I saw them die in a car crash. I stood on the side of the road and looked at the twisted metal. And I felt the grief. It was real. It tore me apart. And then I was alone. Old, unwanted, dying in an empty apartment with no one to give me a glass of water. He fell silent, breathing heavily. Samov wanted to say something, but Siderov stopped her with a gesture. He saw that the confession was not over yet. Do you understand? Morozov looked straight at the investigator, and there was a pleading look in his eyes. These are not just pictures. These are lives, real ones. I felt each of them. I was the scientist who made the great discovery, and I was the bandit who slit his throat for his wallet. I was each of them. I made thousands of decisions, and every time I made a choice, I saw all the paths I had rejected. I saw them go on into infinity, and I knew that at the end of each of them, there was pain, or happiness, which is also pain because it is not yours. It was stolen from another version of you. He raised himself on his elbow, his eyes burning with a feverish fire. That's why we stopped. That's why we looked at the hands. Because in all this crazy kaleidoscope, only they were real. Our hands, the hands of a soldier, not a scientist, not a singer, not a killer. These calluses, this scar, this is the only proof that out of all these thousands of roads, I have walked only one. This one, the filthiest, the loneliest. But mine. His voice broke. He fell back onto the pillow. Tell me, Comrade Major, which one was the real one? The one where I was happy? Or this one? Which one is me? He didn't wait for an answer. His gaze was beginning to dim. His focus was fading. The drug was wearing off, and the abyss from which he had emerged for a few minutes to gulp air was sucking him back in. They're still there, he whispered. They're calling. His eyes closed. His breathing became even again. His body relaxed. Sergeant Morozov returned to his quiet, silent prison. Sidorov pressed the stop button on the tape recorder. In the silence that followed, all that could be heard was the quiet rotation of the empty reels. He looked at Samov. Fear was written on her face, which he thought was incapable of expressing emotion. They got what they wanted. They looked behind the curtain, and what they saw there was worse than any truth, even the most terrible. It was the truth that could destroy the human mind. The truth that hell is not cauldrons and devils. Hell is knowing all the paths you have not taken. Night had fallen on Object 14. It was as sterile and silent as the day. But in the darkness outside Major Sidorov's office, the loneliness was more acute. He sat at his desk, piled high with folders and cold cups of coffee. In front of him, silent and ominous, stood the Yowza tape recorder. He could not bring himself to put it away. It was the only witness, other than himself and Samov, to Sergeant Morozov's terrible confession. Sidorov rewound the tape. With a trembling finger, he pressed play. The office was filled with a quiet, creaky, cracked voice again. I was a hero and a traitor. I built cities and sat in prison. The investigator listened. He was listening for the fifth time. He knew every word by heart. And with each listening, the horror did not dull. On the contrary, it became deeper, eating under the skin. Sidorov, a man who had built a career on facts, on logic, on the ability to separate truth from lies, had encountered something that lay beyond these concepts. Morozov's confession was not just the story of a madman. It had its own monstrous, impeccable logic. He looked at his hands, the ordinary hands of a 45-year-old man, the hands that signed arrest warrants, the hands that held his service weapon, the hands that hugged his wife and son. He had never thought about them, and now he couldn't take his eyes off them. Who would he have been if, at 18, he hadn't gone to the KGB higher school and instead enrolled at Baumanka? Would he have become an engineer? would he have made a discovery? Or maybe if, as a child, he hadn't saved a drowning friend from the river, but had gotten scared and run away, would he have lived his whole life with that burden? Morozov's question, which one was the real one, echoed in his head. It was no longer the question of one broken soldier. It had become his own. Sidorov stood up abruptly, walked over to the window, and lit a cigarette. The smoke filled his lungs, but brought no relief. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass. A tired face, gray hair at the temples. It was him, Andrei Sidorov. But for a split second, it seemed to him that someone else was looking at him from the darkness. A man with the same face, but with different eyes. Eyes that showed no fatigue, but only cold, predatory cruelty. Or, on the contrary, serene happiness. He backed away from the window, putting out his cigarette in the ashtray. Enough. This infection had to be localized, buried, encased in the concrete of protocols and reports. The system did not tolerate questions without answers. If there was no answer, one had to be invented. He sat down at the typewriter. His fingers, which had seemed alien before, became a familiar instrument again. They confidently pounded the keys, knocking out dry, lifeless, saving lines of lies on a sheet of paper. He was creating an official reality, the only one that the state recognizes. He wrote for hours. He combined fact and fiction with the skill of a magician. He took a scientist's diary and turned it into the notes of a madman. He took Morozov's confession and classified it as delusion caused by psychotropic influence. He took an inexplicable anomaly and gave it a simple, scientific, meaningless name. By morning, the report was ready. A perfect example of bureaucratic art. It explained everything without explaining anything. Top secret. One-of-a-kind copy. Conclusion. Based on the materials of case number 41 BS on the incident with the Border Patrol of the military unit in 2014. Date. September 28, 1989. Compiled by Major of the Special Department of the KGB of the USSR, A.P. Sidorov. Based on the investigation conducted, the study of material evidence, the diary of an unidentified person, the testimony of witnesses from a search group, and medical reports on the health of the servicemen of the group of Senior Lieutenant Volkov AV, it was established. 1. In the area of the Valley of Geysers, Kamchatka Krai, there is a local geothermal anomaly. It is characterized by periodic emissions of a steam gas mixture containing an unstudied complex of volatile mineral compounds. 2. These compounds at high concentrations have an acute neurotoxic effect on the human central nervous system. The effect manifests itself in the form of severe cognitive distortions, systemic hallucinations, impaired self-identification, and ultimately leads to the development of acute reactive psychosis, followed by a transition to a state of stable catatonic stupor. 3. The Border Patrol, under the command of Senior Lieutenant Volkov, pursuing a violator of the state border, presumably the author of the found diary, an employee of the Volcanology Research Institute who left the institute without permission, entered the zone of maximum concentration of the said gases, which led to a complete and irreversible loss of combat capability and mental disorder of the personnel. 4. The audio recording of the testimony of Sergeant Morozov S.I., obtained during experimental stimulation therapy, is classified as a delusional state that has no informational value for the investigation. Solution. Recognize the incident with the Border Patrol as a consequence of the impact of unfavorable natural factors. Write off the group personnel as irretrievable sanitary losses. Recognize further treatment as inappropriate. Keeping conditions of complete isolation at Object 14 until natural death occurs. The area of the Valley of Geysers in squares 40 to 55 is to be declared a closed zone with a permanent quarantine regime. Cordon off the area with internal troops. Any entry of civilians or military personnel into the specified area is to be considered an emergency. Case number 41BS is to be classified as top secret. All materials, including this report, the diary, and the audio cassette recording of Sergeant Morozov's testimony, are to be placed in a special archive of the 5th Directorate of the KGB of the USSR. Special note: no statute of limitations. Do not return to the materials. I approve. Head of the Special Department of the KGB for the Far Eastern Military District, Colonel, signature. Sidorov pulled the sheet out of the typewriter. He put his signature. Then he gathered all the materials, the folder, the diary, the audio cassette. He put them in a thick cardboard box, sealed it with wax, and wrote the case number on top. He looked at that nameless coffin, containing 6 lives, 1 terrible truth, and a piece of his own soul. He had done his job. He had protected the system from knowledge that would undermine it. He had restored order. But as he walked down the corridor to hand the box over to the special department for shipment to Moscow, he felt no relief. He glanced down at his hands, carrying the weight. And for a split second, it seemed to him that these were not his hands, but the hands of an archivist or a gravedigger. He didn't know which of these lives was real, but he knew for sure that from that day on he would have to live in each of them.